The wedding cake stood pristine on the counter, untouched beneath its delicate frosting. No one ever cut it. The date was June 15th, a Saturday, a day marked on calendars for months, anticipated with the quiet joy of family gatherings and the promise of new beginnings. The venue was a converted historic barn popular for events, nestled in the rolling hills just outside Summerville, South Carolina, a town known for its Flower Town Festival and azaleas. Inside, white linen-covered round tables, floral arrangements in shades of blush and ivory dotted the room, and soft music played as guests mingled, anticipation building for the ceremony to begin. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a seemingly perfect tableau of peace and celebration. The groom, a young man named Michael, adjusted his tie, a nervous smile on his face, surrounded by his groomsmen, their laughter echoing lightly from a nearby room. His father, Robert, a man in his late 50s, stood slightly apart, a picture of quiet dignity in his dark suit, nodding politely as guests offered congratulations. There was no outward sign of discord, no visible crack in the facade of familial harmony that defined the scene. The air was thick with expectation, the sweet scent of flowers mingling with the perfume of guests and the subtle aroma of the catered meal being prepared in the kitchen. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every element of the day carefully curated to create a memory of joy and union. The bride, Sarah, was reportedly radiant, hidden away in a bridal suite, the soft murmur of her bridesmaids audible through the closed door. The invited guests represented the converging lives of two families, friends from different chapters, colleagues and distant relatives, all gathered to witness the joining of Michael and Sarah. Invitations had been sent months prior, RSVPs tallied, seating charts finalized. This was the culmination of a courtship that had seemed, from outward appearances, happy and conventional. The couple had met through mutual friends, dated for 2 years, and announced their engagement the previous fall. Their relationship had appeared steady, built on shared interests and mutual affection, at least according to those who knew them. Robert had seemed to approve of Sarah, participating in the engagement party and contributing to the wedding plans in the way a supportive father might. Michael was his only son, the pride of his life, and watching him prepare to marry was, ostensibly, a moment of profound paternal satisfaction. The barn itself, with its exposed beams and rustic charm, felt warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the sterile formality of some wedding hall. Outside, late spring foliage was vibrant, the air warm but pleasant, a slight breeze stirring the leaves of nearby oak trees. Parking attendants directed cars to designated spots, ensuring a smooth arrival for the dozens of guests converging on the location. Inside the bridal suite, the bride was having the final touches applied to her hair and makeup, her white dress hanging pristine, waiting to be worn. The groom's party shared jokes and stories, easing pre-ceremony jitters with camaraderie and lightheartedness. Down the aisle, decorations were perfectly aligned, petals scattered gently, ready for the processional. An officiant stood ready, reviewing notes, preparing to guide Michael and Sarah through their vows. The scene was set, the players were in place, the narrative of a perfect wedding day poised to unfold. Guests found their seats, greeting each other with smiles and quiet chatter, settling in for the ceremony. The planned sequence of events was simple: ceremony, cocktail hour, reception with dinner and dancing. A photographer moved discreetly through the space, capturing candid moments, documenting the rising tide of happiness. No one foresaw the abrupt, violent rupture that was about to occur, the shattering of this peaceful scene. No one imagined the hidden history that would violently collide with the present, transforming a day of celebration into a moment of unimaginable horror and profound tragedy. The music shifted, signaling the imminent start of the ceremony. Guests quieted, turning their attention towards the back of the barn, anticipating the entrance of the bridal party. And finally, the bride. The air grew still with expectation. The music swelled, the carefully chosen processional song filling the space. Bridesmaids began their slow walk down the aisle, each a picture of grace and anticipation, holding delicate bouquets. Michael watched from the front, his gaze fixed on the entrance, a mixture of nerves and excitement on his face. Robert stood nearby, watching his son, his expression unreadable but betraying no hint of the darkness he carried. Then Sarah appeared in the doorway, breathtaking in her white gown, her veil trailing behind her, escorted by her father. A collective sigh swept through the assembled guests. She began her walk, smiling, her eyes meeting Michael's. The future stretched before them, seemingly bright and clear. But as Sarah reached the halfway point of the aisle, a sudden, sharp sound tore through the music and the quiet reverence of the moment. A single gunshot echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space. Chaos erupted instantly. Guests screamed, ducking under tables or scrambling for cover. Sarah crumpled to the ground, her white dress staining crimson against the polished wooden floor. Her father cried out, kneeling beside her, his face a mask of horror. Michael, frozen initially, let out a choked cry and started to move towards her. But before he could reach her, another sound cut through the pandemonium, the metallic clatter of a firearm hitting the ground. All eyes turned towards the source of the noise, standing near the front row. The source of the shots was Robert, Michael's father. He held no weapon now, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his face pale and shock-like, yet oddly resolute. The gun lay on the floor near his feet. He made no move to flee, made no move to resist as horrified guests and some wedding party members, recovering from their shock, began to converge on him, shouting accusations and demands for explanation. Michael reached Sarah, collapsing beside her, cradling her head, his voice a raw, anguished sound. The perfect wedding scene had become a scene of unimaginable carnage. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by screams, cries, and the rising panic of dozens of people trapped in a space with a shooter, even if he seemed to have ceased firing. Someone frantically called. Time seemed to both stretch and compress in the horrifying aftermath. Sarah lay motionless, the severity of her injury immediately apparent. Her father was shouting for help, applying frantic pressure to her wound with his jacket. Michael was weeping uncontrollably, his dreams of a future with Sarah dissolving before his eyes. Robert remained standing, strangely passive amidst the chaos he had created. He didn't speak, didn't resist as several guests, driven by adrenaline and outrage, physically restrained him, holding him until law enforcement arrived. The air, moments before filled with celebration, now tasted of fear and the metallic tang of blood. The white linen, the delicate flowers, the untouched cake, all became silent witnesses to the violence. The juxtaposition was jarring, the beauty of the setting brutally violated by the act of bloodshed. Guests were in shock, some weeping, others huddled together, still processing the impossible reality of what they had just witnessed. The image of the father shooting his son's fiancée, the man who was supposed to be welcoming her into the family, was almost impossible to comprehend. It defied logic, shattered every expectation of the day and the relationship between these individuals. The silence that fell periodically, punctuated by sobs and hushed whispers, was profound, a heavy blanket over the scene of destruction. The wedding, meant to signify the beginning of a life together, had ended Sarah's life before it even truly began. Within minutes, the first police cruisers arrived, sirens wailing as they raced down the rural road towards the venue. The barn, moments before a scene of joyous anticipation, was now a crime scene, a place of profound tragedy. Officers, trained to expect the unexpected but rarely something of this nature, moved quickly to secure the area. They encountered a scene of utter devastation. A young woman bleeding on the floor, her white wedding dress ruined, hysterical guests, and a man, identified as Robert, being restrained, offering no resistance. Paramedics followed closely behind, rushing to attend to Sarah, but it was quickly apparent that her injuries were catastrophic. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The confirmation of her death sent a fresh wave of grief and shock through the gathered crowd. Crime scene tape, bright yellow and stark against the natural wood of the barn and the surrounding greenery, quickly encircled the perimeter, sealing off the area. Guests were directed to leave the building, their names and contact information taken, their initial shocked accounts of the event recorded. Many were visibly traumatized, weeping openly as they recounted what they had seen. The shot, Sarah falling, Robert standing with the gun. Michael was inconsolable, clinging to his fiancée's side until gently led away by officers. His grief was raw, visceral, a horrifying spectacle for those who witnessed it. Robert was taken into custody without incident. He remained silent, his demeanor strangely calm, almost detached, as officers placed him in handcuffs and led him to a waiting patrol car. There were no outbursts, no denials, no struggle. His quiet compliance only deepened the mystery surrounding his actions. Why? The question was on everyone's lips, echoing unspoken in the somber atmosphere. Why would a father shoot his son's fiancée? At their wedding, there was no apparent history of animosity between Robert and Sarah, at least none that Michael or other family members were aware of. Their interactions had seemed cordial, appropriate for future in-laws. Initial interviews with wedding guests provided no clear motive. Accounts focused solely on the sudden, shocking violence itself. The recovered firearm was secured as evidence, its serial number logged. Forensic technicians began their meticulous work, documenting the scene, collecting shell casings, photographing the victim and the weapon's position. Blood spatter patterns were noted, the layout of the room mapped. Every detail, no matter how small, was considered potentially relevant in reconstructing the events and understanding the motive. The untouched wedding cake, the scattered petals, the discarded bouquet. They all stood as silent, tragic symbols of a day that was meant to be celebrated, but became a day of mourning. The news spread quickly, first by word of mouth among guests contacting family, then through local media reports, sending shockwaves through the community of Somerville and beyond. A wedding shooting, a father killing his son's bride. The sheer depravity and inexplicable nature of the crime captured immediate, horrified attention. Investigators faced a challenging task, piecing together the timeline of events, and more importantly, uncovering the motive for an act that seemed to defy all reason. The silence of the suspect, Robert, offered no immediate answers, forcing detectives to delve into the backgrounds of both the victim and the accused, searching for any hidden tensions, any history that could explain the sudden, deadly violence. The formal investigation had begun, transitioning from chaos to methodical procedure, seeking truth in the aftermath of tragedy. Robert was transported to the local police station for questioning, the weight of the day's events settling into a grim reality for investigators. Back at the Somerville Police Department, Robert was placed in an interrogation room. He remained composed, answering preliminary questions about his identity calmly, but offered no spontaneous statements about the shooting. Investigators, trying to understand the unimaginable act, began with open-ended questions, seeking any explanation for his actions at his son's wedding. They questioned his relationship with Sarah, his feelings about the wedding, his state of mind leading up to that day. Robert's responses were measured, devoid of overt emotion. He acknowledged shooting Sarah, stating it plainly, but initially provided no reason beyond vague, non-committal phrases about it being necessary, or something I had to do. This lack of immediate, understandable motive was profoundly unsettling for the seasoned detectives. It suggested either a profound mental break or a deeply buried reason. Meanwhile, other investigators were interviewing Michael, the grieving groom, still in a state of shock and anguish. He insisted there was no animosity between his father and Sarah. He recounted their interactions as normal, even friendly. Sarah was excited to join the family, and Robert seemed happy for his son. This testimony from the person closest to both individuals only deepened the enigma. How could a seemingly supportive father, who had actively participated in wedding preparations, suddenly turn a gun on his son's bride on the happiest day of their lives? Detectives began pulling phone records, emails, and social media activity for Robert and Sarah, searching for any communication, any interaction that could indicate conflict or tension. They interviewed Sarah's family and friends, seeking insights into her life, her relationships, any potential enemies or disputes. Similarly, they delved into Robert's past, looking for any history of violence, mental health issues, or conflict that might provide context. The initial profile emerging was one of a quiet, respected member of the community, a loving father, a man with no criminal record. This profile clashed violently with the image of the man who had just committed murder in front of dozens of witnesses. The possibility of a sudden psychotic episode was considered, but Robert's calm, albeit uninformative, demeanor in the interrogation room didn't immediately support this theory. His deliberate actions, bringing a firearm to the wedding, firing 2 shots, suggested a level of intent, even if the motive remained opaque. As the hours passed, the pressure in the interrogation room mounted. Investigators pushed for a reason, highlighting the devastation he had caused, the trauma inflicted on his son, the guests. Still, Robert remained largely silent, offering only cryptic hints. He spoke vaguely of Sarah not being who she seemed, of a past that made her unfit to be his son's wife, statements that confused detectives further, as no information gathered thus far corroborated this. The wedding guest statements, while detailed about the event itself, offered no clues about any prior animosity. They described a normal wedding day unfolding before the sudden violent disruption. This period of investigation, just hours after the event, was characterized by intense confusion and a desperate search for a rational explanation in the face of an utterly irrational act. The physical evidence from the scene was being processed, but ballistics and trajectory could only explain how the shooting happened, not why. The motive remained the crucial, elusive piece of the puzzle, leaving investigators and the public grappling with the horror of the act itself. The untouched wedding cake sat in the barn, a silent, ironic symbol of the future that was extinguished in a single violent moment. The question lingered, heavy and pervasive. What could possibly drive a man to such an extreme act of violence against the woman his son loved, on their wedding day? The answer, hidden for years, was about to surface, changing everything. The breakthrough came late that night, hours into Robert's interrogation. Faced with mounting evidence of his culpability and the investigators' relentless questioning, Robert finally began to speak, not just about the immediate events, but about the past. His voice was low, steady, almost clinical, as he recounted a story that stretched back several years, a story that involved secrets, vulnerability, and exploitation. He spoke of a difficult period in his life, a lapse in judgment that had left him exposed. And he spoke of Sarah, the woman he had just killed, not as his son's beloved fiancée, but as the person who had discovered his secret and used it against him. He claimed Sarah had blackmailed him years ago. According to Robert, he had made a significant financial misstep, a decision outside of his usual careful character, which could have had serious consequences for his business and reputation. Sarah, somehow, had gained knowledge of this. He described receiving anonymous communications, emails, messages, containing specific details of his vulnerability, accompanied by demands for money to keep the information secret. He had paid large sums over a period of months, living under a cloud of anxiety and fear of exposure. He stated that he never knew the identity of his blackmailer at the time. The communications were carefully anonymized, the payments requested in untraceable form. He recounted the emotional toll this had taken, the constant dread, the feeling of being trapped and powerless. He had never told anyone about it, not his wife, not his son, burying the secret deep within himself. The blackmail eventually stopped, he claimed, but the fear and the resentment lingered, a festering wound. He said he had believed he was finally free of the ordeal. Then, his son Michael introduced him to Sarah. The shock, he stated, was immense. He recognized her voice, he claimed, heard certain phrases or mannerisms that triggered his memory of the anonymous blackmailer. Further, subtle details she let slip about her life, her past, began to align with information he had gleaned peripherally about the person who had extorted him years prior. It was a dawning, horrifying realization. He told detectives, connecting the kind young woman his son loved with the anonymous figure who had caused him such pain and financial loss. He had conducted his own quiet investigation, piecing together clues, verifying details, becoming increasingly certain that Sarah was indeed the blackmailer. He described a growing sense of panic and desperation as the wedding day approached. The thought of her joining his family, of her potentially having continued leverage over him, of his son being married to someone he viewed as fundamentally deceitful and dangerous, became unbearable. The wedding, meant to be a symbol of unity and happiness, became, in his mind, the ultimate point of no return, the moment he had to act. He saw it as a desperate measure to protect himself, his reputation, and perhaps in his twisted perception, his son. He claimed the pressure had built to an unbearable peak, culminating in the decision to bring a gun to the wedding and prevent the marriage by eliminating Sarah. This confession, delivered with chilling calmness, provided the motive investigators had desperately sought, yet it opened up a new, complex layer of the case. It transformed the narrative from an inexplicable act of violence to a crime rooted in a years-old secret, and a twisted perception of justice or self-preservation. The revelation was stunning, not only to the investigators but later to everyone involved in the case, fundamentally altering the perception of the victim and the accused. The focus of the investigation immediately shifted to verifying Robert's claims of blackmail, a task that would require delving into Sarah's past and digital life with the same intensity previously focused on Robert's action. The quiet man had just revealed a dark secret, painting the seemingly innocent bride as a calculating extortionist, and himself as a desperate victim driven to an unthinkable act. With Robert's confession of being blackmailed, the investigation took a sharp turn. Detectives now had a potential motive, albeit one that painted a drastically different picture of the victim. The immediate priority became verifying Robert's claims. They needed concrete evidence that Sarah had indeed blackmailed him years prior. A search warrant was executed for Sarah's electronic devices, her phone, laptop, and any cloud storage accounts. Investigators began meticulously sifting through years of emails, text messages, financial records, and digital footprints. This was a painstaking process, searching for any correspondence, any transactions, any digital breadcrumbs that could corroborate Robert's story of anonymous blackmail and payments. Simultaneously, financial investigators began tracing Robert's bank records and financial movements from the period he claimed the blackmail occurred. They looked for significant, unexplained withdrawals or transfers that matched the pattern of payments he described. This required obtaining subpoenas and coordinating with financial institutions, a process that added time to the investigation but was crucial for validation. While the digital and financial investigation was underway, detectives revisited interviews with Sarah's family, friends, and colleagues. They asked more pointed questions about her past relationships, her financial history, any periods of unexplained income or secretive behavior. They were looking for any hint, any inconsistency, any account that might align with Robert's accusation of her being capable of such an act. This line of questioning was difficult and sensitive, introducing doubt about a young woman who had just been tragically murdered. Sarah's family vehemently denied the possibility, portraying her as honest, kind, and incapable of blackmail. Her friends echoed these sentiments. However, investigators knew that people's public personas often masked private realities. They focused on objective evidence. Weeks turned into months. The digital forensic analysis yielded results. Deep within archived emails and encrypted messaging apps on Sarah's old laptop and phone, investigators began to find communications that aligned with Robert's description. There were messages referencing sensitive information related to Robert's past business issue, sent from anonymized accounts. There were also records of significant sums of money being received around the same time, routed through various accounts and payment systems. Attempts clearly made to obscure the source and destination of the funds. While the communications didn't explicitly name Sarah, the timing, the content, and the corresponding financial activity presented a compelling picture. Further investigation into the anonymized accounts revealed connections, IP addresses used to access them, linked to locations Sarah had been, or devices she had owned at the time. Piecing together the digital trail required expertise and patience, but the evidence began to mount. It indicated that Sarah had indeed been involved in the blackmail scheme years prior, targeting Robert. This revelation was profound. It did not justify Robert's actions, but it provided a chilling context for the tragedy. It confirmed the existence of the years-old secret conflict that had festered between them, unknown to everyone else. The seemingly impossible motive, the father killing the son's fiancée, was rooted in a hidden history of betrayal and extortion. The investigation shifted again, now focusing on fully understanding the scope of the blackmail. How Sarah, then presumably much younger and not yet known to the family, had acquired the information, and what her life was like during that period. This layer of the story, revealed through painstaking forensic work and the stark contrast between public perception and private action, painted a complex, disturbing picture of the victim and the events leading to her death. The confirmation of the blackmail solidified the narrative. A past crime had collided violently with a future event, with devastating consequences. The verification of Robert's blackmail claims opened a new, darker chapter in the narrative. It raised immediate and complex questions about Sarah's past and the tangled history between her and Robert that had remained hidden for years. How had Sarah, presumably years before she even met Michael, acquired such damaging information about his father? The investigation delved into Sarah's life during the period of the blackmail. Records showed she had worked in various administrative roles, including a brief stint at a firm that had some indirect dealings with Robert's business years prior. Could she have gained access to sensitive information through that connection? Or was there another more direct link between them from that earlier time, that Robert hadn't initially disclosed or perhaps hadn't even known existed? The details surrounding the blackmail itself were meticulously examined. The amounts demanded and paid were significant, suggesting Sarah was either in desperate need of money or was highly calculating. The methods used for anonymization indicated a degree of technical savvy or perhaps assistance from someone else, though Robert maintained his belief that Sarah was the sole blackmailer. This raised the possibility of accomplices, adding another layer of complexity, though subsequent investigation focused primarily on Sarah's direct involvement as the confirmed recipient of the funds and originator of the key communications. The most baffling aspect remained the years that passed between the end of the blackmail and Sarah's engagement to Michael. Robert claimed the blackmail ceased entirely. Did Sarah believe she was in the clear? Did she have any idea she had blackmailed the father of the man she would one day fall in love with? Or had she known and deliberately pursued the relationship, perhaps seeing an opportunity for future leverage, or simply feeling a perverse sense of connection to the man she had extorted? The investigation found no evidence to suggest Sarah knew Robert was Michael's father during the blackmail period. Their paths had crossed only through the anonymous transaction. The horror for Robert, according to his account, came years later when he connected the dots between the woman Michael was dating and the person who had blackmailed him. He claimed he recognized her not necessarily physically at first, but through subtle cues, voice patterns, or perhaps specific knowledge she referenced that only the blackmailer would possess. Then, he began his own secret inquiry to confirm his terrifying suspicion. The psychological impact of this revelation on Robert must have been immense. To discover that the woman his son intended to marry, the woman who was to become a part of their family, was the same person who had caused him such profound distress and financial harm years ago, is almost unfathomable. He claimed this realization consumed him, leading to increasing paranoia and a sense of dread as the wedding day approached. He saw the marriage not as a celebration, but as the ultimate betrayal, the blackmailer cementing her place at the heart of his family. His narrative painted a picture of a man trapped by a secret from the past, overwhelmed by a sense of injustice and impending doom, leading to a final desperate act of violence. The contrast between Sarah as the beloved bride-to-be and Sarah as the blackmailer was stark and deeply disturbing. It highlighted the capacity for individuals to compartmentalize their lives and present different faces to the world. For investigators, verifying this hidden history was crucial to establishing a plausible motive, even if the act itself remained morally reprehensible. The past had reached out and violently reshaped the present, turning a day of anticipated happiness into a scene of profound tragedy rooted in years of buried secrets and unresolved grievances. The complexity of this hidden relationship, unknown to Michael and everyone else, became a central focus of the case, attempting to understand the psychological pressures that had culminated in murder at the altar. With the motive established as revenge stemming from past blackmail, the case moved towards the legal arena. Robert was formally charged with murder. The evidence against him was substantial: multiple eyewitnesses to the shooting, the recovered firearm, his own confession, and the corroborating evidence of the blackmail found in Sarah's digital history and Robert's financial records. However, the blackmail introduced a significant mitigating factor, albeit one that could not excuse the homicide itself. The prosecution's case would focus on the premeditation, Robert bringing the gun to the wedding, the deliberate act of firing. They would argue that regardless of Sarah's past actions, her murder was a cold-blooded act of revenge, carried out in a public place, causing immense trauma. The defense would center its strategy on Robert's state of mind, presenting the blackmail as the catalyst for his action. They would argue that he was driven to a state of extreme emotional disturbance, feeling trapped and terrorized by Sarah's past actions, and the prospect of her entering his family. They might introduce psychiatric evaluations to support the claim that the revelation of Sarah's identity as the blackmailer had a profound psychological impact, culminating in a break from his normal character. The victim's past would inevitably be put on trial, creating a difficult and painful situation for her grieving family, who had just lost their daughter and now faced accusations about her character. Michael, the son caught in the middle of this devastating conflict between his father and his deceased fiancée, became a key figure. His testimony would be crucial, recounting his perspective on his father's demeanor leading up to the wedding, his relationship with Sarah, and the horrific events of the day. Forensic evidence from the scene, including ballistics reports confirming the bullets that killed Sarah, came from the gun recovered at Robert's feet, and trajectory analysis provided objective details of the shooting. The medical examiner's report detailed the nature of Sarah's injuries and confirmed the cause of death. This official documentation solidified the physical facts of the crime, leaving the legal battle to focus on the intent and the motive. Pre-trial motions were filed. The defense sought to introduce the blackmail evidence to support their claim of provocation and emotional disturbance. The prosecution acknowledged the blackmail occurred but argued it did not negate the elements of premeditated murder. Legal arguments revolved around the admissibility and interpretation of the evidence, particularly how the jury should weigh Sarah's past actions against Robert's fatal response. The case garnered significant media attention, fueled by the shocking nature of the crime and the bizarre years-old motive. Public opinion was divided, some expressing horror at Robert's actions, others finding a perverse understanding in the face of past betrayal. Highlighting the complex moral questions raised by the case, the legal process moved deliberately, each step scrutinized, each piece of evidence analyzed for its potential impact on the narrative presented to a jury. Robert's calm demeanor continued through pretrial hearings, interpreted differently by prosecution and defense, as cold calculation by one side, as shock and detachment from trauma by the other. The stage was set for a trial that would not only decide Robert's fate, but also publicly dissect the hidden lives and devastating secrets that had culminated in tragedy. The trial, when it finally commenced, was a somber and emotionally charged event, drawing national attention. The courtroom, a formal space of dark wood and hushed tones, became the yanare where the two competing narratives of the tragedy unfolded. The prosecution presented its case first, focusing on the undeniable facts of the wedding day shooting. Witnesses recounted the scene of joy turning to terror, the shock of seeing Robert, the father of the groom, standing with a gun. The forensic evidence was presented methodically. The crime scene photos, the ballistics report confirming the fatal shots came from Robert's weapon, the medical examiner's testimony detailing Sarah's injury. The prosecution painted a picture of a deliberate, calculated act of murder, arguing that Robert, harboring a long-standing grudge, chose his son's wedding as the time and place for his violent revenge. They emphasized the planning involved, bringing the loaded firearm to the venue, and the horrific impact on everyone present, especially his son. Michael testified, his voice thick with grief and disbelief. He recounted his relationship with Sarah, their happiness, and his utter shock at his father's actions. His testimony was deeply moving, portraying the devastating human cost of the crime. He testified that he had no knowledge of any conflict or animosity between his father and Sarah, making the shooting seem utterly inexplicable to him until the motive was revealed. The defense then presented its case, not denying that Robert killed Sarah, but seeking to contextualize his actions within the framework of the blackmail. They called witnesses who spoke to Robert's character prior to the incident, portraying him as a reputable, loving father. They introduced the evidence of the blackmail, presenting the digital communications and financial records that corroborated Robert's claims. They argued that Sarah's actions years prior constituted a severe form of psychological torment and financial drain that had left Robert with deep-seated trauma and resentment. A forensic psychologist testified for the defense, explaining how the sudden realization that the blackmailer was the woman his son was about to marry could have triggered a severe emotional crisis, leading to a state of extreme emotional disturbance that impaired his judgment and control on the day of the wedding. Robert himself took the stand, recounting in detail the period of blackmail, the fear and anxiety he experienced, and the shock and despair when he recognized Sarah as the blackmailer. He described feeling increasingly trapped and desperate as the wedding approached, seeing no other way out. His testimony was quiet, measured, lacking overt remorse but framed as the actions of a man pushed beyond his limits by years of silent suffering and a final unbearable revelation. The prosecution cross-examined aggressively, challenging Robert's claims of emotional disturbance and arguing that his actions were cold and premeditated, highlighting the time elapsed since the blackmail ended and his deliberate planning. They suggested he had other options besides murder, such as informing his son or going to the police about the blackmail years ago. The defense countered that his fear of ruin and the specific timing of the wedding, integrating his tormentor into his most intimate family circle, created a unique, unbearable pressure cooker situation. The trial became a stark examination of motive, intent, and the law's capacity to account for complex psychological states and hidden histories in the face of undeniable violent acts. The fate of Robert rested on whether the jury would accept the defense's argument that the blackmail and its psychological impact constituted sufficient grounds to reduce the charge from murder to a lesser offense like manslaughter due to extreme emotional disturbance. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Robert guilty of murder. While acknowledging the blackmail had occurred and played a role in the events, they ultimately rejected the defense's argument that it reduced his culpability to manslaughter. The The premeditation involved in bringing a weapon to the wedding and deliberately shooting Sarah in front of dozens of witnesses, combined with the significant time elapsed since the blackmail ended, led the jury to conclude that this was an act of murder, not a spontaneous reaction driven solely by immediate emotional disturbance. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read, the tension palpable. Robert showed little reaction, his face impassive, a continuation of his stoic demeanor throughout the legal process. Michael, seated with other family members, appeared devastated, the verdict offering no solace for his double loss, the death of his fiancée, and the conviction of his father. The sentencing phase followed. The prosecution argued for a lengthy prison sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime, the public nature of the shooting, and the profound trauma inflicted on the victims and witnesses. Sarah's family delivered victim impact statements, sharing their grief and the irreparable void left by her death. They spoke of her life, her dreams, and the injustice of her violent end, their pain evident and raw. The defense pleaded for leniency, reiterating the context of the blackmail and Robert's previously unblemished record. They highlighted the years of silent suffering he claimed to have endured, and presented letters of support from friends and colleagues who spoke to his character outside of this single horrific act. Robert spoke briefly at sentencing, offering a quiet statement expressing regret for the pain he had caused, though the depth of his remorse for Sarah's death remained ambiguous, intertwined with his narrative of having been a victim himself. The judge considered the arguments, the evidence, and the impact of the crime. He acknowledged the complex circumstances involving the past blackmail, but emphasized the severity of the violence and the calculated nature of the act. Robert was sentenced to a substantial prison term, ensuring he would spend the majority if not the rest of his life incarcerated. The sentence closed the formal legal chapter of the case, but the human story, the devastation left in its wake, continued. The community was left grappling with the reality of the hidden lives that had intersected so tragically. The image of the wedding day, meant to be a joyous celebration, was forever marred by violence. The story of Robert and Sarah became a grim cautionary tale about the destructive power of secrets, resentment, and unresolved conflict. The aftermath of the trial and sentencing left a profound and lasting impact on everyone connected to the case. Michael was left adrift, mourning the violent loss of the woman he loved and grappling with the horrifying reality that his own father had been her killer, driven by a secret history he knew nothing about. The relationship between Michael and his father was irrevocably shattered, a chasm opened by the events of the wedding day that no legal outcome could bridge. Communication became difficult, if not impossible, strained by grief, betrayal, and the grim reality of prison bars. Sarah's family endured immense pain, not only from the loss of their daughter but from the public revelation of her past involvement in blackmail, which added a layer of complex grief and public scrutiny to their mourning. The trial, while bringing a form of justice for Sarah's death, forced them to confront a side of her they may not have known, adding to the trauma. The community of Somerville, which had watched the events unfold with shock and disbelief, slowly began to process the tragedy. The venue, the historic barn that had been a symbol of celebration, became a grim landmark, forever associated with the violence that occurred within its walls. Future weddings held there, if any, would carry the weight of its history. The untouched wedding cake, a potent symbol of the future that never was, eventually became a morbid footnote in the retelling of the event. It served as a quiet, heartbreaking reminder of the abrupt halt to life and love. The case, with its bizarre motive and public setting, lingered in the public consciousness, a stark illustration of how deeply buried secrets can erupt with catastrophic force, destroying lives and shattering illusions of normalcy. The quiet, respectable father and the radiant bride were forever redefined by the events of that single terrible day. The legal process had provided a resolution in terms of guilt and punishment, but it could not heal the wounds inflicted. The emotional fallout permeated the lives of the families involved, leaving scars that would likely never fully fade. The story of Robert and Sarah, a tale of love, betrayal, and deadly secrets, concluded with a father in prison, a fiancée in the grave, and a son left to navigate a future irreparably altered by the devastating collision of past and present. The silence that settled over the aftermath was heavy with loss, a haunting reminder of the human cost when hidden truths are exposed through violence. The carefully planned wedding day, meant to be the start of a new family, became instead a monument to destruction, a stark, tragic end to multiple lives and relationships, marked forever by the terrible sound of gunshots shattering celebration.